One of the first things I was sort of interested in, Henry, is just in thinking about the war and so on. What was your own personal experience with the war?
Oh, it was so ridiculous you wouldn't believe it. I I was drafted late, and I forget 42 or something like that. And I was limited service because I could only see partially out of one eye. And so I did basic training, was sent up to Fort Niagara. I think it's now a park or something like that. So we did the 3 months there, and then they busted them all up, these limited service guys, and I got orders to go to Governor's Island in New York, where I spent all the war with the so-called, what the hell they call that thing? I've forgotten it. It was an investigative unit. I've forgotten it. CIC, Counterintelligence Corps. That's what it was supposed to be. And we run around and follow people and read FBI reports and check out guys who were officer candidates and things like that. And that was it. And then when the war was over, I missed a shipment to Japan. The guys under MacArthur, once we were in Japan, many people were in the occupation, and was discharged, and that's it. Went back to piano business. Hardly a heroic war. Meanwhile, my older brother had been out in the Philippines for 5 years, and all that. So that was my unexciting career. So I was there for a lot of this kind of stuff.
Do you specifically remember where you were and what you were doing on Pearl Harbor Day?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
It was a Sunday, and my father had a favorite restaurant, Luchow's in New York, and we were having lunch there. And I think we came back to the house because somebody said on the radio they bombed Pearl Harbor. And that's then because we turned on the radio and heard all about the terrible things that were going on and so on. We all knew it was going to be a little bit different from then on. There was no indication. We knew in the news that those famous, there were two ambassadors or something who were either going to the White House, or I remember that. And all of a sudden, they bombed Pearl Harbor, and that was it. And it was all radio, of course. There was no television then. The news we got the radio, and they told us all kinds of crap that was not true. They bombed some of the Japanese things, which they didn't. They didn't talk about the size of the destruction there. We didn't really know that till after the war was over, that they'd sunk the Arizona and put all those guys on it. And those amazing pictures that you get now from the Japanese side that show these guys. Unbelievable. You can sit there in Hawaii and see where they came through the mountains.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Tell me, in leading up to the role of Steinway during the war, what was the rations like as a United States citizen? I mean, all of a sudden we already had a depression, so people were sort of used to not having everything.
Yeah.
But then we went from not having everything to having very little, rubber and gas. Absolutely. And all of that. Tell me a little bit about how that was.
Well, it was an entirely different thing in that day. Once Pearl Harbor, that was it. Everybody was engaged. Up until that time, there had been a perfectly normal bunch of people who called America First that believed we should stay out of the war. But once they bombed Pearl Harbor, everybody in every way, so different from today. This is it. We've got to go and fight this guy and do what's necessary. And so as the government passed regulations, you couldn't get gasoline, you couldn't, I remember we had food coupons and things like that. it was all perfectly normal. I mean, the war was on, and you expected to sacrifice something, and the taxes started to go up. We were all paying more income taxes and things like that. I can't remember the timing. Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 41, so this must have been after that at some point. Up to then, just been fighting around. Nobody believed anything. But then the Germans went into France. When was that? That was before Pearl Harbor, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the time, 41 in the summer, or 40, something like that. And that was serious enough, but when they found Pearl Harbor, then we, America, knew that we were in it for sure.
Hmm.
So that's my memories of that. And almost anybody my age can tell you where they were when they first heard about Pearl Harbor.
I bet.
Because it was such a shock, such an unbelievable shock. And now there's all this criticism of the removal of American citizens of Japanese descent from the West Coast. We were all for it. I mean, we didn't know that the submarines and the battleships weren't going to land in San Diego. And so when the president said we're going to move these guys to the middle of the country, nobody said, "Oh, watch out for their civil rights," and hell with it. That's, I mean, it's strange now. Everybody, how could you not object to that? It didn't even occur to me. It's a young guy.
Another thing that I learned from you that I was hoping to get your comments about, Henry, is just that sense of pride that Americans had, that this was our duty to sort of bond together.
Absolutely. It was so different from Vietnam or anything like that, that everybody was going to do it. A lot of people volunteered right away. I didn't. I hung around. I figured they'll get me sooner or later, as everybody did. You signed up for the draft, you got examined, and all that sort of thing. And you waited till your number was called, and off you went and did whatever you were supposed to do. And the women all went to work, women who'd never worked before, not only industrial work, but office work. My wife worked for the Navy in a place where they read and translated cables somewhere down in Wall Street, and every cable came through there, and no matter what it was, they changed the wordings, so it wouldn't be a code thing, If it was from some soldier that said, the wife telling him, son born Tuesday at 9 o'clock named Alexander, they'd say Alexander, a son was born, something, so that they changed the wording in case there was some code from some spy in the cable. So everybody was working, was not expecting much. And the food stuff, there was plenty around, but you had to get a ticket for this and a ticket for that. Forgotten really what they all were. It's all was so routine. I remember when it was finally over, and by that time Polly and I had been married, and all of a sudden the restrictions on automobiles were lifted. And so my father-in-law had the car. We said, "Geez, we can take a drive now." We got the car and drove out Long Island somewhere just for the fun of driving and seeing something again. It was great. So that's my memories of that stuff. Long ago now.
Sure is. How exactly was the company first affected by the war? What was sort of the first change?
Well, there was, I can't remember the actual time, but after Pearl Harbor, when the idea was materials became very scarce, and again, there was some war production board was set up by Roosevelt and had complete control, never questioned what their authority was or whatever. These guys were told what to do and told us what to do. And they passed a limitation order that you could not produce pianos after a certain date. And we were supposed to even give back the few things we used, like the bronze hangers on our action frame and the tubes we used in the action and all that, which we didn't do, frankly. We thought, Jesus, this is just stupid. We'd wait and see if they take them away from us. But we had to stop manufacturing pianos, and we'd been looking for several years for something to do in the factory. And we tried and couldn't really find anything until finally this guy in the Army Service Department that we'd been calling on, he called up home, and I was there, and he said, we got a guy here who's got a contract to make a glider, and they need a factory and they need something, and I said, send him around, this sounds great. And so we got together, and it was a Boston outfit, and the name was General Aircraft Corporation, and some guy up there knew somebody and had gotten this contract to make the CG-4A gliders, and they didn't have literally a pot to piss in. They had no factory, they had no organization or anything. And so we had these empty factories. At that time we had 3 factories in Astoria, and the 2-story factory was empty. So we rented that to them and as the prime contractor, and they subcontracted to Steinway and Sons all the woodwork, which was considerable because they were trying to save materials. The fuselage of this thing had the only metal in it, which was metal rods of some plain kind, which they hung some kind of fabric over. And all the rest was wood. It had an elaborate nose that lifted up where the pilot and co-pilot sat. Had a very complicated floor because it had to be light and at the same time carry the guys or the piece. And then there were these enormous wings and the tail surfaces, all the tail surfaces that were made in that way that really model airplanes are made. Little pieces of wood stuck together and then plywood bent around the outside. And that was duck soup for us to do. And so we got these guys set up in their factory to make the fuselage part, and then our factory, we had to move the pianos actually out at one point. We moved them into a warehouse, and they sat there for a couple of years while this glider thing went on. And then we manufactured all these wood parts, and had 1 million inspectors around, and all that. Employed lots of women for the first time. Had to reconvert all our plumbing facilities, which were entirely designed for men. We never employed women before. And they were wonderful and enthusiastic, of course, too. So that's how the whole thing started. And the other contractors, they wanted to pass it around, and the other people who had glider contracts, one of them was Pratt Reed and Company, which was one of the 2 big key in action companies, and they got a prime contract, and they took one of their plants in Deep River, Connecticut, and converted it. And I used to see Pete Comstock, who is now gone, but was my age. He and I were buddies for a long time. I wound up being on his board and all that stuff. And we exchanged information at that time about where to get the parts for these things. You had to have, the big thing, of course, was how the wing connected with the main fuselage. You had to have the right kind of things that were then inspected, not optically, but with X-ray. That was new then, to make sure that these iron things wouldn't fall apart. And in fact, in the file, I think that Mike has, there's a picture of one of these things where the wings fell off, and there were a bunch of dignitaries in St. Louis, a contractor named Leicester Kaufman out there. They took these guys up in a glider flight, and the wing fell off, and there's a picture of this thing going down. We all thought, boy, this is the end of this program. But they said, no, there was a faulty connection or something, and we kept on making them, and they all stuck together, so it must have been one of those accidents. But that was it was spread around. I believe the largest amount of gliders were produced actually by Ford, who had that giant woodworking outfit in northern Michigan, and because they had all the clout in the world. They had built factories to make airplanes and everything else. So they converted their woodworking thing, and I think, if I remember the figures in the file, that they made the most gliders, and I forget how many General Aircraft made, maybe 1,000. And these things had to be made, of course, and then I think they fitted them together to make sure that they fit, then take them apart again, then put them in boxes that were shipped by all the boats over to mostly England, where they were put together. And they were used several times. And that whole history is in this museum in Lubbock, Texas, that is a World War II glider museum. And I'm sure they'd be glad to cooperate, and they'd be thrilled, I'm sure, if the Navy is going to do something. And they have the only complete glider that I've seen. Now, there may be others. They tell me there might be one in Wright Field in Dayton, or parts of one. There's supposed to be one out in Long Island in a museum that I've just been too lazy to go out there and look at. And so there's interest in this, and of course there's the World War II Glider Pilots Association, who are all my age, and they're all dying off, but they still have meetings here and there. There's a lot of oral histories and guys with books about doing this, and they were very brave souls, these guys. They were often people who, I guess, washed out of the other airplanes or something like that. And the pilot and the co-pilot sat in the front of this thing, and they had to bring these things down in the fields and so forth.
Do you have any idea how much they weighed?
No.
They were pretty light.
Oh yeah. They were designed to be light. I mean, I remember making the floor was one hell of a job because it was mostly air. You had plywood. They used plywood a lot. 3-5 plies of thin plies of plywood, and then the floor had little braces all over it. It was quite a job to make. And the idea was it had to be light. You couldn't just put down some boards and that was it. And it had it could hold a Jeep or a small artillery piece of some kind, or these 15 guys or 16 guys. And we had to make the wooden seats, sat on the seats and so forth.
And how many did Steinway make?
It was the general aircraft thing, and I've forgotten, but it's I think around 1,000. I'm not sure.
Wow.
Over, that would be 42, 43, 44, I guess, whenever. By the time I was through in the Army, it was gone. The whole thing was over.
Wow.
The company dissolved. I don't know what happened to general aircraft. They disappeared back again into their separate parts, I guess. Some Boston guy who really was the money man behind that. I mean, the fellow with the influence, an old flyer. But this museum in Texas has films of these things actually in use, including one use was in the CBI, the China, Burma, India, when we were chasing the Japs over the mountain and the way into China. And there they experimented with snatching them back up again, which sounded to me absolutely fascinating. These great pieces, most of them busted up when they landed, but if they had a whole one, they'd come by with a C-54 with a hook, jerk this thing back up again. And they apparently were able to do this a couple of times. I mean, unbelievable things that these fellows did. And they were all guys like me with a lot of more guts than I have, I can tell you that. It was really something. And they were, I think, first used in the invasion of Sicily. This is all stuff that's in the museum, and it's in the records that you can get from if you guys in the Midway want to dig in more. There's a lot of literature out there, and they have actual films of these things. But in the first use going into Sicily, they pitched it up completely. They cut them off. They lost many guys and planes. And they dumped in the water. Nothing happened to the water. That was the end of that. I mean, there was no way they could pick them up. And crashing in funny places in Sicily, and so there was a mess. But then I think one of the best uses, they claim, was in the Battle of the Bulge, when the weather was lousy. You may remember that was one of the problems. And finally, when it lifted a little bit, they towed some gliders in and dropped them there with what they needed, which was ammunition and some food and stuff like that. And the gliders got in and furnished them till the trucks could roll again and get going again. So that, I think, may have been the last use, but that's all in the record down there at this place in Lubbock, Texas, which is in the Lubbock Airport. And it's the Silent Wings Museum, they call it.
Oh, neat. Going back to the Steinway factory, for a second. You had said that when they began making the gliders, you needed to move out the pianos that were there. Were these pianos that couldn't be completed because of the lack of metal?
That's right. That's right. They were, it takes us a long time to make a piano, and I have an L grand in my house. The rim was bent before the war, and then it had a few substitutes which we put in, like iron wound bass strings instead of copper. That was the one saving. And then to save the metal tubes, we made one of them out of just plain wood. And my piano that's still in existence today is one of those. And then it was wheeled back after the war and finished up. And then I was married in '44, and my father gave me this piano. It's one of these L's. So I treasure having one of these things that survived the war. And we just moved into a warehouse for a couple of months, and then when this glider thing collapsed, they came back and we cleaned up and went back in the process. And it was a long business getting back started again in the piano business after the war, because one of the suppliers, Wickham Piano Plate Company, he didn't want to start again because he was afraid we had under price controls at that time. He said it was going to cost too much. And we all said, Wickham, for Christ's sake, start up. We need the plates, and then whatever you have to charge us afterwards, go ahead and charge us. He's a stubborn guy. But eventually he did start up, and then there were problems like that. And then a lot of action makers had gone out of business, so they were left down to two, Pratt Reed and Company, and the other one was Wooden Brooks Company in Buffalo, and the Thayer Action Company in above Milwaukee there somewhere. We were together. And so they had problems getting started and training new people and the usual stuff. So slowly we got started again, and everything was fine. And the glider just disappeared into the nowhere.
Were there any modifications to the factory regarding the gliders? There's one story that there had to cut the door to get them out or something like this.
We were lucky. We had been in the foundry business up until just before the war, and our foundry building had that was where we made the wings, which were 80 feet long and about 18 feet from the nose to the back part. And we had these great assemblage. It was dirt floor because it's a foundry, so we had to throw a concrete floor in there and fix it up minimally with lights and stuff. And at one time we had, I think, 300 guys on that floor alone, making wings. And then that was made in what's now our Steinway Place factory. And the assembly plant is about 6 blocks down Steinway Street at our other factory. And so we towed them through the street. And of course, it was wartime. That was the kind of thing nobody objected to that. Stopped the traffic. And all tracked that. We made a little gadget and dragged these things up to the other factory. And I wish we had pictures of that, because that was something. I remember the old guy who drove the tractor. That was his job. So he said, back up and hook this thing and take it down the other factory. And he loved it. And so then the assembly plant, the 6-story plant there, we made the nose. I remember that was a very complicated thing to make this nose that lifted up. And these million little pieces that went into the wing, that like a model plane, they were these ribs of all different sizes. And of course, bending stuff was easy for us. We did the rib bending. Instead, they were amazed. They thought there was a tip on the wing. It was just a laminated piece, looked like a piano rib. It was nothing. We built a rib press and made it like nothing. So that was what went on. And we had as many as, I think, 1,200 people in a couple of shifts. And we've never had more than 300 or 400 that we have now in making pianos. So there was a lot of activity and night stuff going on, and women that had to be taken care of. One of the things we had to do was, they called it doping the surface. I can't remember now, but it's something stinky that shrank the fabric on some part. So you had to have one room completely relayed with plastic and so on. And I think 50, 60 women in there doing this all by hand. So that's about what I can remember the manufacturing. But as you say before, everybody was cooperative. The attitude was fine. And we'd been unionized in 1939. So according to the union contract, when everybody who went away in the army was entitled to get his job back, which only made sense. So as this thing wound down, a lot of the women went home because they wanted to, and a lot of the others who wanted to continue, they had to go if a guy came back and started again, wanted to start again with us because they were entitled to their place. But one of the interesting things among, I don't know if this is a sideline, but among the employees, a lot of them who were working class employees, and they got in the army and they realized they could do better things. So they took advantage of the GI Bill of Rights and got better jobs. And that was a nice thing to see. They'd come back and visit us and they were a lawyer or something like that.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
How exactly did the GI piano get started? Did the government approach Steinway?
There again, on the GI piano, our sales manager at that time, whose name was Roman Majewski, I think he was the guy who found out that they were buying equipment and they needed pianos. So he went down to sell Steinway pianos. And I remember the illustration that he used when somebody said, "What the hell, we got Steinway's the best piano, we don't need that, we need something for these guys to play." And he said, "What kind of socks do you buy for the guys? Do you buy good socks or bad socks?" "Oh, we buy the best socks." And it's about, buy the best piano, it lasts longer and so on. I always loved that argument that Majewski used. Anyway, they gave us to it. There was another company who wanted to make a wood piano, a little guy in Pennsylvania, and I think he got a contract for some of them. Meanwhile, the others, it was just too much work. We got the contract. Then we had to go to each of these production boards and get the rights to use the material and go back to the action makers who then, again, showing the willingness. They didn't have to, but they were so thrilled. They dusted off the machinery and got it started again to make the actions and keys for Steinway on this stuff. And we recalled from the glider program, the old guys who knew how to assemble them again, and made these batches of stuff for the Army and the Navy. And it was thrilling to us to have it in the pictures that some are in Mike's file, and they got even more down in this museum. And you have in your resource center several pictures of these. They sent out jazz bands. So there are pictures there of these jazz bands that were entertaining the troops at that time, who are all soldiers themselves. So that's how the glider thing kept, and we kept on quite a while after the war. They were sold, and then what were left over, we fitted some legs on and sold them as Victory pianos. And so it was a very rewarding thing. I mean, after all, that was the business, and we are proud of some. I have a picture that I think's in the file of Walter Damrosch. Walter Damrosch was a leading musical figure seated in one of these. Joseph Hoffman, greatest pianist, seated in one of these things, and words of praise about this wonderful piano. So that was a thrilling thing for us to do, and it was set up around the corner with the glider parts still going on, mostly in our upright department, which was a separate wing of the factory.
Did you have a lot of history of upright pianos before that?
Yes, oh yes. Steinway had, going way back, Steinway really developed a good, solid, upright piano. Old Theodore Steinway, who was the designer, he said, "These crazy squares you guys are making are nuts. They're bad design. I could make a good square, a good upright." And he did, because the industry followed and it became the staple product. and Steinway made them. And then in the 20s, when we were quite successful and the grand demand was enormous, we were sort of dribbled out of the upright business. And then in the late 30s, we started in again when the attractively styled small vertical came in, introduced by, I forget the name of the guy, who was the first fellow that brought them in. The trade show was full of excitement about this new, very attractive piano. And so we had to get into it too. And then we went back in the upright business in 1938, 36, somewhere in there. I remember because that again was very exciting to me, starting up seeing how the old uprights we used to make with a lot of guys assembling things by hand. We said, the hell with that, we're going to make jigs and patterns for putting the backs together and simple things like that. And we had a lot of experience with the electronic machines, so that we still use. And so that was interesting to develop all that. We made quite a few small uprights. So we have an expertise in that and still do.
Well said. The design of the GI piano, was that a whole lot different than what you had done before?
No, it was one of the exterior design was adapted from a modern style, modern, which is now, we called it modern then, it's Art Deco now. Simple lines, round corners. I think it was, we cribbed a Donald Desky design or something like that. I can't remember who we copied. And our internal designer, a fellow named Eugene Ayuso, Ayuso, a lovely fellow. And so he designed this particular model with the rounded arm and everything rounded off and the toe piece, and so it would be strong. And but the basic inside of the piano was this upright scale that we had developed from our older scales in 38, I guess it was. So the basic piano was there, and the design was something new, case design.
Where did the idea of painting them colors come from?
Well, that was part of the contract. I mean, you furnish the government. What do you do? Olive drab. I mean, like the trucks and the buses and everything else was olive drab, including the uniform. I mean, it was before you had jungle stuff and so on. Everybody had brown suits, and so that was prescribed. And for the Navy, we made some in gray and some in blue. That was the color they had for their things. So that was not an idea to make them colorful. That all came later with other manufacturers. We never were crazy about blues and greens and all kinds of wild colors.
There's a story that Mike was telling me about the uniqueness of the crates that these GI pianos
right.
would go into.
Yeah, we designed a special box for them to go into that we also made in the factory. The idea is it looked like the old-fashioned upright crate. You pushed it into it, and then a thing flapped down on top and flapped in the front, and it had two big things on the side, so you could run a piece of wood through. No, I think we had them fold up so 4 guys could carry this thing from. You'd take it off the truck, and 4 guys could put it where they wanted it in the field or whatever, and then put it back in. And we put a little tuning kit in there too, a tuning hammer, and some extra strings and a few things like that that fitted into this piano box. None of them have survived as far as I know. It'd be fun to have one in the exhibit, but like the glider boxes, I mean, all those were made out of wooden boxes, not plywood. And I was told to go back to that in England, many of the guys in the assembly think they like living in these boxes better in the Quonset huts than these round Quonset huts. But a couple of guys say, oh, I've got this thing that holds a wing 18 feet high. It was a palazzo, so we went in and lived in them. And of course they all got burned up sooner or later. So that was the box for the GI thing. That worked out very well.
It was actually big enough where somebody could actually go in it?
Not the piano box, but the glider box,
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
The piano box was made particularly for the piano, And apparently worked quite well because you could put it on the truck and then when lift it off. They didn't have tailgates in those days. And to lift the thing off and set it down, instead of just throwing it off, which they were used to, hey, use those handles. Guys take it out and handle it gently.
There's also a rumor floating around that some of these pianos were actually put on the ground by parachute.
I have no idea. We have no idea what happened to them or where they went. We just had in the filers who shipped order number so-and-so to a certain location. And there was this special service within the Army. They had books printed, they bought the pianos, they had all kinds of recreational material that was sent out all over. I remember seeing once in a book plan, they were like paperbacks, but there was something different. They were made specially, and all kinds of novels and good reading and so forth that was sent out overseas. I was in some warehouse somewhere that I saw that. Must have been good pianos, or they were showed it to me at one time. So that was a whole episode, that Army Special Services, and they did wonderful things. And they sent out these jazz bands wherever there were a lot of players. I had one employee, Al Bianchi, who was an excellent jazz pianist, and he was drafted, and he also was on Governor's Island and played piano for the general who was there. And then his time came, and they were going to send him to Europe, and he said he was actually on the gangplank going up when they hollered his name. And so he reported to somebody. And the general said, "Get my piano player back." And so Bianchi missed the war by playing piano for General, if I got his name, on Governor's Island. We liked him. He could play all kinds of jazz and that sort of stuff. Yeah. A lot of stories of that kind, of the good kind and the bad kind, that happened to various people. But everybody did what they were told. Nobody objected. Nobody had civil rights and all that. The country was at war. We were going to get it over and fix those Germans and eventually the Japanese. Just like when the bomb fell on Nagasaki, there wasn't a great many people weeping about that. I mean, if we'd had to go into Japan, we would have killed lots and lots of Americans. I still believe that. I don't think they would have killed them. I know we were burning Tokyo, which we didn't know till after the war, but they've been quite successful with incendiaries in Tokyo. But that was their homeland, and knowing those guys, they would have killed a lot of Americans. So anyway, that's my personal unpopular view of atom bombs.
Was it pretty well known what other companies were doing for the war effort? For example, did you know that Baldwin was also making airplane wings and so on?
No, I had heard that Baldwin was making spars for something else. Oh. They made some, Jim Mixter, you interviewed him, and he knew all about what they went there. But there wasn't much contact, except we all knew each other more or less, and everybody was doing different things. And then it was after the war, when we got together again as an association, we were talking about getting plates started, getting this, and what are we doing to promote piano playing. That became our principal thing in the war. Forget it, nobody was remembering that. Hardman Peck on the west side, they made something too. I've forgotten what. It may have been spars for this wing. I think they worked with Pratt Reed, that was it, because this 80-foot wing had an enormous, great Western spruce plywood thing. Had to be glued up, which was the right thing, instead of solid. They were glued up in certain pieces and had to test to a certain strength. That's what Hardman made. Winter in the Bronx, I'm not sure what they made. And then a lot of them just went out of business and they didn't. Worlds, I don't know what they did. They had that big plant in DeKalb, so they must have done something.
The War Department, when you talked to them, was it important to have music, important to have the piano being part of the entertainment?
Our guy had sold them on that, and I think it wasn't only our guy, but this special service people realized that, well, I mean, all those wonderful entertainers like Bob Hope and the things that went around, and everybody knows music is good for you and it cheers people up. And so just like they had books and they had music, and when you think music, what is it? It's a piano. You guys could, and they'd actually, when they didn't have an orchestra, you'd get a piano, the guy could play it, and everybody can sing and yell and have a good time. And so they believed that down there.
In one of those pictures of the crate, they had a whole bunch of, looked like kazoos and ukuleles.
Yeah.
Was that shipped with all the pianos?
I wouldn't be surprised if the special services shipped stuff like that. That was self-play instruments of some kind. I don't know whether somebody in this industry must know about it, but I don't know who. Because we didn't know these guys. Once they just sold, the orders came through in little batches, and we sent them wherever they sent. Different depots usually, distribution stuff. And I guess Majewski kept in touch with them to see if everything was all right, but they were satisfied.
You told me an interesting story about a GI piano that was on a sub that they were trying to take out and recover.
Yes, that was after the war. Really a different one, but that was very interesting. The commander of the Edison, one of the first atomic submarines, called Steinway and said, there was a piano on that thing, where is it? And he chased it down, and the thing was, we had delivered it in the 50s sometime, before the sub was completed and all that stuff on top. And when they decommissioned it back in Groton, some idiot told them, oh, these things fold up and you can take them out. So they banged around on this trying to get it out through the thing. And then somebody said, wait a minute. So they waited until they took the other thing apart. And they took the piano out. And it's government property, of course. And this relentless Navy commander ran it down and found it in the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Boston. And Jerome Murphy of Steinitz went down there and looked at it, and there it was ever since they took the thing out of the decommissioning, with rat shit all over it and everything else. And they were able to take it back, and very nicely Steinitz did a basic cleaning up job, and then it went back to the Steinway factory where they completely rebuilt it. But that's not connected with your thing, is it, Mike?
I don't think so.
It's around somewhere. I mean, if the Navy ever wanted it for a display, it belongs to the Navy.
That's
And
very interesting.
Where it went. And that was I think it was a GI. I've forgotten exactly which model it was, but it was made for that submarine. Interesting story, because that was when those things would spend long times underground on patrol, and they wanted a piano for the entertainment of the crew. So that's the story of the Navy piano.
Did they send you special paint so the colors were matched to their formulas?
Just the color, the OD color. We had our supplier make it up for us, as I remember. The Murphy Varnish Company, they could do anything. So it was no trick to that. It was just the color that was important to the Navy and the Army. Olive drab brown. It was the same as you see on the trucks and everything. It's just their color. And the Navy, the same thing. They had a certain navy blue that they wanted, and gray.
What did it mean when they called it a victory piano? What exactly was that?
Well, that was Steinway's name for it. We didn't call it the GI piano. We had to have a name for a piano, so we called it the victory piano.
I see.
And then after we did have victory, as I say, we had some leftovers, and so I have a picture of them somewhere. They stuck some chromium rods between the toe piece and the arm, and I forget what color, whether we repainted them or what happened, and sold them off retail.
It's an interesting history.
Yeah.
Were there any special preparations they did for the pianos for tropical climates or anything?
No, not at that time. No. we used to prepare pianos for tropical climates before the war by screwing down the ribs and very elaborate procedure. And one of the last ones was a concert grand that was to go to a place in Manila. And it disappeared in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. The thing was bombed somewhere. There may be some of those, but with air conditioning now, it's not necessary. I mean, any piano that you sell in the tropical area is going into some place that's air conditioned. So we haven't had a request for years for a tropicalized piano.